Israel's strike targeting Hamas officials in the Qatari capital of Doha shocked the world. Hamas officials had been discussing the latest ceasefire proposal sent by the US, as it looked like both parties were considering a new, comprehensive deal to end the war. Yet Israel's targeting of the group's leader and top negotiator, Khalil al-Hayya, has put that assumption into question. While Israel's bombing of a mediator country was unprecedented, critics of Netanyahu's government say they are not surprised, and that this follows a pattern of the Israeli government's approach to negotiations. They point back to May of last year, when Israel rejected Hamas's response to a ceasefire proposal and invaded the southern city of Rafah instead. After the invasion, Israel then struck Hamas's lead negotiator and the head of its political wing, Ismail Haniyeh, in Iran in July of that year. And just 2 months later, in September, pressure for a captive deal was mounting again as Israeli society was outraged by the death of 6 captives in Gaza. Netanyahu's office was tied to leaked documents, falsely claiming that Hamas was planning to smuggle captives to Iran and that the group wanted to prolong the war rather than reach a deal, both of which were proven to be untrue. The leaks reportedly aimed to decrease pressure on the government for a captive deal at the time. Yet hopes rose once more in January of this year when Israel and Hamas reached a phased deal in return for the release of captives. But after just 6 weeks, Israel unilaterally broke the ceasefire, cutting off aid to Gaza and renewing bombardment of the Strip. Since then, US President Trump has alternated between saying a ceasefire is just around the corner and suggesting a US-led takeover of the Strip that would expel its population elsewhere. Still, Hamas hoped its release of Israeli-American captive Idan Alexander in May of this year might renew momentum. Trump promised the group would get something in return, but failed to deliver. And by June, attention moved elsewhere. The US and Iran were in the middle of talks over a new nuclear agreement, with the next round scheduled for that weekend, when Israel launched a wave of surprise attacks across Iran, with the US later joining in. Needless to say, talks fell apart. By mid-August, Hamas had accepted the framework for another deal, despite its concerns about the gradual timeframe, given Israel's previous breaking of a ceasefire in March. But Israel's government seemed to ignore the response, saying instead that it no longer wanted a phased deal and instead wanted a full comprehensive one that would be much harder to finalize. Now, as Hamas and Israel were reviewing the latest US proposal, an Israeli strike targeted the senior Hamas leaders in Doha, including Khalil al-Hayya, the group's top negotiator. Now, several comparisons have been made with the assassination of Haniyeh last July, noting that killing negotiators can often lead to them being replaced with less compromising leaders. Haniyeh's position was replaced by Yahya Sinwar last year, and there are now concerns that if other foreign-based Hamas leaders are killed, the role could move to Hamas's military commander Izz al-Din al-Haddad in Gaza, slowing progress on the talks. But these comparisons go back beyond Haniyeh's killing. Israel's assassination of Hamas military chief Yahya Ayyash in the middle of the Oslo talks set off a wave of retaliatory attacks by Hamas in 1996 and made it much tougher for Fatah leader Yasser Arafat to negotiate with Israel. The following year, Israel's attempted assassination of Hamas political leader Khalid Mash'al in Jordan once again threatened to derail the peace process and inflame regional tensions. Critics argue that regardless of the tactical merits of these decapitation strikes, the impact ultimately made it more difficult for the Palestinians to negotiate as a united front and increased public perceptions that peace talks were merely a front or a guise, inviting retaliatory attacks in consequence. While Hamas's senior leaders in Doha appear to have survived, the attempt has confused much of Israeli society, over 70% of whom would prefer a deal that ends the war and returns the captives. They don't understand how negotiations can proceed if Israel continues to strike lead negotiators and change the parameters of the deal. In the wake of the strike, Qatar is reportedly considering halting its mediation efforts, while Israel's military prepares to invade Gaza City. Here with me to discuss the impact of these strikes and what the strategy behind them might be is former Israeli negotiator and president of the US Middle East Project, Daniel Levy. I think very few of us expected that strike on Tuesday. We know Qatar has long hosted Hamas officials to mediate negotiations with Israel. It's not as though Israel was unaware of this or only suddenly found out. So why did it conduct this strike now?
Well, first, let's acknowledge that a few days prior to this strike, the Israeli chief of staff had said that Hamas leadership would be targets anywhere. Apparently, clarifications were asked for and given by the Mossad chief that there would not be strikes in Doha. We see what that was worth. As you say, it's senior Israeli officials, the head of the Mossad, the minister responsible for negotiations now, the Israeli negotiating team have gone back and forward to Doha. Have often spent extended periods of time there. Qatar has been one of, and in fact, the lead accepted mediator. Israel has now conducted this strike on sovereign Qatari territory, and it has done so at this particular moment. So the question then as to why now would seem to revolve around this increased momentum, this increased verbiage coming out of the Trump administration. We're putting a deal forward. It's now or never. Hamas apparently being forward-leaning in pretty much continuing to put forward the, let's be honest, reasonable terms that they had set out throughout this and saying they would engage with this. Mm-hmm. One could make the claim that Netanyahu would trying to advance the talks by increasing the pressure by conducting this kind of an operation. I don't think anyone buys that, not the Israeli public, not the hostage families, not anyone who's paying attention for the last 23 months. The more obvious claim would be this upends the talks, kills any prospect of progress. But I actually think that leaves open a very important question. Did Israel really have to revert to something so overt, so in your face, in order to achieve that? Israel knows how to scupper these negotiations. Israel is used to playing the Americans, getting them to align with its narrative. This doesn't feel to me like it was driven by any Israeli sense that they were on the precipice of being pressured into something. And in fact, if the Americans had reached a place where they were determined to get the Israelis to agree, would this be the way of pushing the Americans off? So I don't even buy that. Yes, the effect is to make a deal even less likely, but I think it was pretty unlikely anyway. This feels to me like it was primarily sending a signal elsewhere, sending a signal to Qatar and the region that Israel is moving ahead with its project of regional hegemony by asserting unassailable military preeminence. And even if you don't like what we're doing, and even if you think you have cover because you hosted a large American base or because you're a close American ally, you don't have cover. So you have one alternative: bend the knee and accept subservience. That feels to me like what this was about.
Interesting. Yeah, as you mentioned, it was shockingly overt historically when Israel has conducted these kind of strikes on foreign soil. They've been very quiet about it, taken credit for it months later. But obviously, as soon almost as the strikes were completed, we saw Netanyahu go to the US embassy in Jerusalem and give quite a triumphant sounding speech about it, which is very out of line with previous tactics. So you mentioned kind of maybe this wasn't so much tactical, so much as sending a signal, sending a message. And you mentioned previous comments that no Hamas leaders anywhere are safe. Who is Israel sending that message to? Obviously, we know there are Hamas officials and historically mediation efforts in Egypt, in Turkey. Is Israel trying to say anyone is fair game now if we deem it fit? I mean, what is the message and the target audience they're trying to go after here?
So tomorrow, one always has to include the domestic element, right? There's always a domestic audience for this. I don't think this moves Netanyahu's approval rating numbers one way or the other. Those who want to believe that this is going to work, will continue to believe so. I think perhaps the other side of the ledger is stronger, which is this is an even more transparent display of Netanyahu's absolute disinterest in the Israelis being held in Gaza. By the way, quite difficult to mount an effective mobilization of opposition when almost the entirety of the Zionist political camp have been cheerleaders for this. So today, all the people who are the putative heirs to Netanyahu, if he were to lose an election, Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, Avigdor Lieberman, have come out and welcomed the strike. Bravo. So that's the state of play domestically. I don't think it does him a lot of good. It also doesn't cost him. Therefore, I think the audience is, as I've said, the region. And I think the message to everyone is, whatever you don't like about what we're doing, you have no alternative. That's the gamble, I would argue, that Netanyahu is taking. Netanyahu is saying, yeah, I'm losing some popularity, but once they see we're winning, once they see we are unassailable, look, at the same time as this, as you mentioned, Israel has apparently carried out a drone strike against the global Sumud flotilla of aid to Gaza in Tunis. It's attacking Sana'a, the capital of Yemen today. It has attacked Damascus, Beirut, Iraq, all in recent months, Tehran, of course. And Israel, I think, is taking as Netanyahu would see it, reasonable gamble that Arab states do not have a military answer, regional states do not have a military answer. They will not band together. They will continue to hang apart, not be able to coordinate. And the rest of the world, and especially Israel's Western allies, yes, they'll face domestic pressure, but eventually the news cycle will move on and they will say, well, we're aligning ourselves with the winner. And by the way, can we buy some of that kit? Because it looks rather tasty and maybe we can use it elsewhere. And especially that narrative will work with the Americans. They like to be on the side of winners. I don't think they initially planned to get involved in that 12-day Iran-Israel when Israel initiated that war. But eventually they joined what they thought was going to be the winning side. So that's the game that I think Netanyahu is playing. Of course, I don't want to pretend there's not a Palestinian angle to this. Palestine, the Israeli campaign to destroy, kill, remove, ethnically cleanse the Palestinians is always front and center of this, because that's the heart of all of it. The fact that this is an unfinished settler colonial project of eviscerating the indigenous population. And that's where Israel, I think, feels it needs to work militarily. It's interesting that Israel has no soft power project. It's not like Israel is anymore coming and saying, hey, join us. We've got all this great tech and we're the startup nation and all of this. It's basically saying, if you can't resist, you have to basically take the knee. And the question is there the capacity to deter, to contain Israel? And I do think that much as that feels a long way off, that is the unavoidable question in regional capitals right now.
And as you say, in terms of military dominance in the region, Israel has proven over the past years it's pretty much unparalleled and unrestrained, carrying out unilateral attacks on Iran, on Syria, on Lebanon, on Yemen, and so on. We know that when the U.S. wants to restrain Israel, when it forced it to sign that temporary ceasefire in January before taking the hands-off approach, when it forced it to abide by the ceasefire at the end of its brief war with Iran, and the jets had to turn back, and so on. So we know when Trump wants to intervene to restrain Israel, when Israel acts contrary to his interests, he can do so, and he can apply that pressure. What do you think it will take to get that pressure? Because many people would have said a close U.S. ally, Qatar, invested billions in Trump and in the U.S., hosting its largest airbase, as you mentioned. Most people would have thought that would have been a red line. People often look towards, Israeli-Turkish tensions in Syria, for example, Turkey being the second largest NATO member and a valuable U.S. ally in the region. What would it take for the U.S. to act there more decisively to prevent these kinds of attacks? Because like you said, I think a lot of us are quite skeptical that the US was only informed far too late and had no say in it. What do you think would be the red line?
So first of all, let's build this up. If anyone could go toe-to-toe militarily, that doesn't exist right now. It's not necessarily something that can be guaranteed in perpetuity. I don't want to just say it's the US because there is the internal conversation in Israel. If the Israelis actually felt that the incentive structure looks different, the cost-benefit calculation looked different, that Israelis couldn't travel visa-free to Europe, they would have to perhaps sign some kind of declaration that they were not involved in committing war crimes or inciting to genocide. If the Israeli assets that were held in European banks were perhaps looked at and perhaps frozen and perhaps used to make good on the destruction Israel has caused in Gaza. If Israel's trade and arms relations look different, that could set off a different conversation inside Israel. Yes, you are right that the thing that brings this to a more grinding, immediate halt is if the US decides it is going to sustain a standoff with Israel because it provides those weapons, it provides the political and diplomatic cover, the economic support, and it uses its power to try and leverage third-party states. What could lead to a shift in that? First of all, might there be external actors that turn around and say, this doesn't work for us. We're your ally. We put a lot of investment in you, the US. We need to see that this raging bull is contained
we know
because it doesn't work for our region. And finally, I would say, and it's moving far too slowly, but there is the domestic debate inside the US. The public opinion has shifted, and you see inside the MAGA camp even, and I think this may exacerbate that trend, this intensify what Israel did in Doha. People saying, wait a minute, haven't you just embarrassed the US? We were mediating. You killed the negotiators in the country that was doing the mediating. That's our ally. This makes us look bad. This isn't America first. Unfortunately, none of that is moving fast enough, Tamara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for those insights. That was Daniel Levy, former Israeli negotiator and president of the US Middle East Project. Thank you, Daniel.